Hello and welcome to my video about chess draws. It turns out that there are many different ways that you can draw a chess game. I think that it's commonly understood that there's only one way. People often think that you can only shake hands on it, or that stalemate's the only draw, but there are actually lots and lots of ways. Some of them are more interesting than others, so I have some examples to show the really interesting ones. But just to kind of rattle them off to get this started, the first way that you can draw is by agreement. So that's when you guys shake hands and just say, I think this is a draw. And like all the other draws, you can only make a draw offer or a draw claim on your own move. That's an important thing to remember. It's considered good etiquette to generally offer a draw only once or after a really major change in the position on your own move. Another way that you can draw is by stalemate. This one's pretty famous because one of the weird rules about chess is that if you have no moves that you can possibly play, the game ends in a draw, not as a loss. In some other games, if you have no moves to play, that means you lose. But not in chess. Another way that is a little less understood is insufficient material, which means that it's not really possible for you to continue the play and just becomes a draw. It means you both have kings. There's also threefold repetition. This one's a really finicky rule because you have to understand that the entire position has to happen 3 times. It's not the same move. So if you just make that same move 3 times against the world champion, they're going to have to explain to you that that doesn't mean that you get to draw the world champion. It has to be the same exact position, including whose move it is. There's also a fivefold move rule, which is less known, but we can talk about that in a minute. There's also the 50 move rule, which means if you have 50 moves with no pawn moves and no captures, and one move in chess is both players together, so that means 50 moves for white and black. So 50 moves like that, no pawn moves, no captures, the game can end as a draw at that point. There's also a 75 move version of this rule, which I will explain. The next kind of draw is the insufficient winning chances. This is one of the weirdest and the rarest. I'm kind of ordering these in order that you might see them as you get more interested in chess. The insufficient winning chances means that even if your opponent has run out of time, if it's not possible for you to win, even against the worst possible play, the game will end as a draw. And that's sort of a protection for people who are trying to win in a winning position where they couldn't possibly lose, who run out of time trying to find the checkmate. And the last way to get a draw that I'm going to be talking about today is a draw by mutual exceedance of the time control in sudden death, which is really, really, really weird, and mostly only happens in, for instance, 5-minute blitz tournaments. Now, so the draw by agreement's really easy. On your move, you will say, I think this is a draw, I offer you a draw, make your move and hit the clock, and then if your opponent agrees, the game's over. I think this is one of the kind of weakest ways to make a draw. I don't really like it. So let's move on to talk about stalemate. Stalemate is a really interesting one. Let me show an example. Stalemate means you have no possible moves whatsoever. So, one of the ways that you can try to salvage your game when you're losing is to leave yourself in a position where you would have no moves if they made a move that they have to play. For example, to get out of check. So, in one of my games this happened, which was really fortunate for me. In this position I had black, and I was really pestering my opponent to try to beat me here. And they had 3 connected passed pawns, but it was really difficult for them to avoid a draw by repetition, which is another one of the draws that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. So they played the move queen f7, which is a mistake, and here you might want to pause the video and see if you can solve this as a puzzle, black to play and draw, using stalemate. Stalemate usually happens only when you have very few pieces, but it doesn't have to be the case that it's only when you have the king left. Some people say that stalemate happens when you have only a king, but it could be with many, many other pieces on the board. In this case, though, there will be just a king left. So one way that you could get a draw here is by playing queen b1, which is what I chose. And then after king to b3, queen a2. Or queen b2. Both of these lead to different kinds of draws. But the crux here is that if they play any move except taking the queen, for example, if they go here, they're actually losing now. So they're actually forced to take this, and because it's my turn with black and I have no possible places to go, the game ends in a draw right away by stalemate. So this is just one example. I have a few other funny examples of stalemates from my games. When I was preparing for this, I noticed that I've only gotten 5 stalemates ever in all the time that I've been playing over the board. So that was an interesting example of a stalemate, and that arose more or less by force. I've had some other funny ones where people just kind of stumble as they try to checkmate me. Perpetual Check is a form of the threefold repetition, so why don't we get into that one? So, if you get the same position 3 times, the game ends as a draw. You might even be wondering why we have such a situation. Well, the reason for that is if you don't have a rule like the threefold repetition, you could find yourself in a position where in a tournament the game is just going on, and you have no way to make the players finish the game, but neither one of them actually wants to quit trying to win. So the way that you can make them call off the game is by having this option to come out if the same position is happening over and over again. This is sort of similar to some rules in other games like Go, where if the position's repeating, then the game might just end on the spot. So here's an example. This one's just from an online game where I thought that the position was quite interesting. And this is actually part of a puzzle, or it could be seen as a puzzle. So in this position, it was white to play, and they're trying to survive after black played the canny move bishop takes g2, and they played queen takes g6, which is a really desperate way to try to keep some life in the position. And here you have to choose between queen takes g6 and king takes g6. Queen takes is the better move because after king takes there's a draw by perpetual check. And the reason, so perpetual check is not like a rule of chess, it's just a technique by which you can get a draw by repetition. So here, if we're solving this with white to play, just see if you can find out how they repeat the moves. This is pretty easy because draw by perpetual check just means you have to look for the checks and find out how you can check in a sequence such that they never escape from the checks. So it should be with bishop d3 check. Here they have only 2 options. This one's really bad because they lose everything. They're just a full rook down pretty much, not good. So they can only really consider king f7. The next check is easy to find because bishop g6 they'll just take it, so bishop c4 makes sense. Now if they go back, we have a perpetual already, right? They go back, we give them a check. So the more interesting thing is what happens if they play one of these moves. But as you can see, if they play a move like king f8, we can already win the game because they have to give up their queen and then everything else to avoid checkmate in this instance. And if they go here, we can probably take our pick of like good discoveries. I kind of like bishop takes f4 because with this discovered check, we're going to take their queen. And for that reason, instead of being ambitious here, they should settle for the repetition. And this is a really kind of weird repetition, which is why I wanted to show it. I thought it was really interesting. Because it's not every day that you see repetition on the light squares in a position with lots of pieces, and it's just the bishop giving checks. So yeah, that's an example of a threefold repetition. And there's also a fivefold repetition version, and I'll show this game from my recent tournament as an example. Now, this one wasn't exactly like a fivefold repetition. The idea of the fivefold repetition is that if 2 players are playing in a tournament and they're repeating the position and they refuse to actually claim the draw, which you can only do on your own move, an arbiter can step in and just say, like, hey, this is a draw. I've seen it happen 5 times, so that's it. So it's kind of a special case of the threefold repetition. But in this game, I claimed a fivefold repetition, which was just to be a little bit cheeky with my opponent. My opponent had just defended well with the move c5, which is forcing a draw. You can analyze this if you want to try to understand why I shouldn't take the pawn. But anyway, this position's totally dead. So I started moving my bishop around just to kind of like see what he would do and be a little bit cheeky about it. And the reason I picked this example is not just to show like how cheeky I am, but to illustrate how it's not always that the same move has to be played, it's that the same position has to happen. So I think the position that we should keep a careful eye on is this one, where the bishop's on b3. The pawns aren't going to move, so we're keeping an eye on these 2 bishops. Okay? So this counts as the first repetition of this position. Okay? Now, the bishop's there twice now, but the king's on d6. So if you're trying to, like in the middle of a game, you're trying to see, like, have I reached a threefold repetition yet? You have to remember that in either of these positions, if my bishop's on b3 and their king's on one of those squares, then it could be a draw. But you have to get either this one 3 times, where the king's here and the bishop's here, or this one 3 times. So anyway, they're keeping the king on d6, and I'm just going back and forth on b3. So now this position, you'll notice that it's happened twice, right, because the king's here. We had this situation just a moment ago. This position's also happened twice. Now this is the 3rd time, but my opponent, it was his move, and I expected him to claim the draw, but he didn't claim the draw. So I just kept kind of messing around, and we reached the same position. And here, normally if an arbiter was watching, they would probably step in and say, like, this position's happened 5 times, you guys can shake hands now. So I just went ahead and did that myself. I just said, I claimed fivefold repetition, and my opponent was not very amused, but ended in a draw. So that's an example of a threefold, or in this case, a fivefold repetition draw. There's also a 50 move rule, and I don't really want to show an example of that because it might be a little bit dull to watch for 50 moves. But actually, you know what? I think I do have an interesting example of that. There's also, on live chess only, as far as I know, a 300 move rule, where the game immediately ends on move 300. So I have a funny example where my friend was playing, and I'll just show the whole game really quickly. This is just one of his many endless online blitz games. And he showed me because of the humorous way in which he bullied his opponent into submission after having obtained an advantage, which is not very nice, and I don't recommend people to do it, but sometimes I have to admit it is really funny. So anyway, this is all the early game stuff. So clearly no 50 move rule going on here, because the 50 move rule only kicks in when there have been no pawn moves and no captures. This is in contrast with the common belief that the 50 move rule means chess games can't be more than 50 moves long. That's clearly not true, because we often have like an endgame in a world championship that is more than 50 moves, just the endgame. In fact, if I scroll ahead a little bit, you'll see that this is move 50 right here, where he promotes to a knight. Being a little bit more cheeky, because you know this would have been a checkmate, but didn't do that one. He made a knight just for fun. But this is move 50, so clearly games can go beyond 50 moves here. And so the funny part starts where he can play 50 moves. He can only play until move 50, and if he hasn't moved a pawn and he hasn't captured in that time, the game immediately ends as a draw online. In real life, you have to claim it. You say, I think that 50 of the moves that I wrote on the score sheet are not pawn moves or captures, therefore a 50 move draw. So anyway, let's see. Starting from move 50, he makes a knight. So that was a pawn move, so the counter's at 0. So if we go ahead to move 100, if he hasn't moved a pawn or captured anything in all that time, it would be a draw. But here he captured something, so the counter goes back to 0. So that's how you keep track of that. Now this person didn't seem to want to bother capturing that knight, so I think this is where the trolling begins. Alright, so he captured one more, and then that was a pawn move, so every time this pawn's moving, the counter goes back to 0, and now you can see this pawn can't move. So this is like move 1, 2, 3, and that's a capture, so it goes back to 0. And then that's a pawn move, so all these pawn moves don't count. Now the funny part is that he started doing this thing where he starts running his king all around, and every time he gets like closer to 50 moves, where it would become a draw, on like move 49 he'll move a pawn. So he's moving his king the whole time, doing really nothing, just trolling his opponent, then he'd move a pawn. So if you want to be really, really annoying in your chess game, you can do this. You can move the pawn once within 50 moves, and then start again. And then just keep going to see how long it takes for your opponent to resign just to get away from you because you're so crazy. But the reason I want to go all the way to the end is that on live chess, even though this is not an official USCF or FIDE rule as far as I know, on move 300 it ends as a draw, except for in one situation. So let's go ahead. He's just like trolling and trolling, and this is move 200. Oh, my game actually cut off because the game was just so long. But what he did in this game was he did more or less the same thing that you saw here over and over again, but then on move 298 he played g7. No, on move 299 he played g7, and on move 300 he played g8 and made a rook, and then it was checkmate. So that's a sort of funny thing. It could end as a draw if you dally too long on light chess. But 50 moves is normally what you have to look out for. Anyway, that was kind of a funny game. Really long coming. Maybe more interesting is the insufficient winning chances, because this is hard to explain. In FIDE, I believe they call this the dead position. Yeah, I think I have an example here. Okay, so imagine you're playing this position in a sudden death time control, which means probably it's most of the time controls that you guys are playing. If you run out of time, you lose. That's called sudden death. This is in contrast with time controls where you get a second period after you've run out of time, or something like that. Some tournaments have extra time on move 40, so those are it's not sudden death until after you've hit move 40 and you got all your time. So if it's like a 5+0, that's definitely sudden death. So this rule applies there. Now, insufficient winning chances means even if you're winning, for example, here you might say that black is winning because they have a rook. If they flag, you don't necessarily get the right to win the game as the side with the bishop. And the reason being that you cannot checkmate even against the most hideous, horrendous play with just one bishop. And just to prove that, you might... So, alright, maybe we could frame this in a tournament setting. So let's say that you claim a win as white, and your opponent says nuh-uh, and you say yeah-huh, and then you have to go and call the tournament director. What the tournament director would say is like, well, what would the checkmate look like if they know this rule really well? And then you would have to set up a checkmate where you have a bishop and they have a rook and they lose the game. First of all, if they lose the rook, you cannot checkmate with one bishop. That's something that's pretty well known. If you're not convinced, try to set it up on the board. But you know, if you want to say that black's going to play really badly, you can control black and just make them do some really dumb stuff. You could try to make them put their rook in a really bad place, but it's just not going to work, because it turns out that there is no situation in which their rook can trap their king, because whenever you give that check, they can always block. They always have a legal move, and no matter how badly they play, if there's only one legal move, they have to play it, and there's no way that you can make them trap the king without putting the rook so close. So that's kind of a proof that even if you flag with black here, you are not going to lose the game, because checkmate is not possible. But you have to be really careful with insufficient winning chances, because if it was a bishop, like a technically weaker piece, whoever flags here actually loses, because let's pretend that black flags and white claims the win on time because the flag fell on the clock, and they dispute it, and if the TD asks you to set up the checkmate, it's actually quite easy. You bring this bishop over to next to the king, and then give a check, and that's mate. So situations like this can be really tricky. This would not work if it was a knight, so you see this is like very specific, right? You can't just make an argument based on the material or like the history of the game or how you feel about your opponent. Those things don't matter. You have to be able to show what the checkmate would be. Okay, now oh, by the way, so there's also a 75 move version of the 50 move rule. I forgot to mention that. So online, the game terminates after like 300 moves, but in a tournament, the tournament director can count 75 moves with no pawn moves, no captures, and just end the game at that point without asking the players. So that's sort of a clarification of the 50 move rule, and it's one that's not very commonly known. The last one, though, I think is probably the most rare and weird and annoying kind of draw. And this position is not an example of that. This is sort of a conceptual thing. So imagine if you're both playing a 5-minute game, and one player flags, and the other person doesn't call it, and then you're playing, and like maybe you've even noticed that your time ran out, and you're just not saying anything because you don't want to claim a win for your opponent, right? And then their time runs out. When they look at the clock, they see 2 zeros, right? Their 0 and then your 0. when there are 2 zeros on the clock, you can claim a draw because of mutual exceedance of the time control. So that's mostly a problem in Blitz. That doesn't really happen over the board. But it does go to show you that if your opponent runs out of time, you should claim it right away so that you don't give them any chance to say, well, they both say 0, that's a draw, because they might be right about that. So anyway, I hope you guys like my overview of the ways that you can get a draw in chess, and you guys can look forward to more videos about this, because I'm putting together a series on things you need to know before your first tournament. Until next time, take care and good luck with your chess.